Most people think they're making their own decisions. They're not. Every single day, your emotions are being pulled by other people through guilt, approval, fear, criticism, rejection, and silence. And here's the part nobody tells you. The moment someone can control how you feel, they can control what you do. That's not an exaggeration. That's just how human behavior works. Emotional detachment is not about becoming cold. It's not about caring less. It's about becoming someone whose inner world cannot be hijacked by someone else's behavior. And once you understand how to do that, the way people interact with you changes permanently. Part 1. Why emotional people are easier to influence. Here's something most people never think about. Your emotions are not private. They're visible. And the moment someone can read your emotional reactions, the moment they know what makes you defensive, what makes you seek approval, what makes you pull back in fear, they have a roadmap to your behavior. Think about it. If someone knows that criticism makes you crumble, they'll use criticism to control you. If they know that praise makes you compliant, they'll use praise just as easily. If they know that silence makes you anxious, they'll go quiet at exactly the right moment and watch you bend yourself in half trying to fix it. Emotional people are not weaker people. They're often the most perceptive, the most caring, the most intelligent people in a room. But emotion without control is a lever, and anyone paying attention can pull it. Here's what most people never realize. You don't have to be a cruel or calculating person to do this to someone. Most of the time, people influence each other emotionally without ever being fully conscious of it. A partner who goes cold when they don't get what they want. A colleague who praises you right before asking for a favor. A friend who makes you feel guilty for having a life outside of them. None of these people may have a deliberate strategy, but the effect is the same. Your emotional reaction becomes their tool. The dangerous part is that most people never see it happening, because when you're inside the emotion, when you're anxious, hurt, flattered, or afraid, you're not observing the situation. You're reacting to it, and reaction is the opposite of power. Part 2. How people unknowingly give others power over them. Pay attention to what happens in your own life for a moment. Someone doesn't text back quickly and your mood shifts. Someone makes an offhand comment and it follows you for 3 days. Someone at work gives you a cold response in a meeting, and you spend the rest of the afternoon replaying what you might have done wrong. Someone you care about seems distant, and suddenly you're doing everything you can think of to close that gap, adjusting your behavior, softening your words, working to re-earn something you didn't lose. That's not love. That's not kindness. That's emotional dependency. And it hands other people power over you that they didn't ask for and that you don't even realize you're giving. Here's what's really happening in those moments. You've made someone else's behavior the source of your internal state. Their mood becomes your mood. Their approval becomes your stability. Their silence becomes your anxiety. And once that pattern exists, you're no longer responding to reality. You're responding to them. Think about it from the outside. If someone knows that their coldness makes you anxious, they don't even have to intend anything. Their natural mood will move you. If someone knows that their approval lifts you, you will unconsciously shape yourself to receive it. Not because you're weak, because that's what emotional dependency does. It rewires your behavior around another person's emotional output. Most people miss this completely because it feels like caring. It feels like being invested. It feels like love or loyalty or conscientiousness. And sometimes it is those things. But underneath it, when the caring makes you controllable, when the investment makes you compliant, when the loyalty makes you afraid to disappoint, it has crossed into something else entirely. You've given someone a remote control to your internal world, and most of the time, you gave it to them willingly. Part 3. The hidden costs of emotional dependence. The cost of emotional dependence is rarely dramatic. It's quiet. It accumulates slowly in decisions you barely notice making. You don't say the honest thing because you're afraid of their reaction. You stay in a situation longer than you should because leaving might upset someone. You don't pursue what you actually want because the approval you'd risk losing feels more urgent than the goal. You edit yourself constantly, reflexively, not because of your own values, but because of their perceived judgment. That's where emotional dependence becomes genuinely dangerous. Not because someone is manipulating you, though that can happen, but because you are manipulating yourself. You are making yourself smaller, quieter, more palatable, more available, more agreeable on an ongoing basis to manage how other people feel about you. And over time, the cost of this is your own clarity. You lose track of what you actually think because you've spent so long thinking about what you should think to be accepted. You lose track of what you want because you've been so focused on what's safe to want. You become, gradually, a version of yourself that was designed by other people's comfort rather than your own truth. Here's the uncomfortable part. You probably already know what it feels like to be in this state. The low-level anxiety that lives in the background. The constant monitoring of how you come across. The relief when someone approves of you, a relief that feels disproportionate, like you'd been holding your breath without realizing it. That relief is important to notice, because it tells you exactly where you've handed your stability to someone else. The dangerous part is that once emotional dependency becomes a habit, it starts to feel like personality. It starts to feel like just who you are, someone who cares deeply about others, someone who is sensitive, someone who values relationships. And maybe all of that is true, but caring about people and needing their approval to feel okay are two completely different things. One is a strength. The other is a vulnerability that never stops costing you. Part 4. Why manipulators target emotional reactions. This is where people lose control, and they never see it coming. Manipulative behavior, whether it's conscious or not, almost always targets the same thing, your emotional reaction. Not your logic, not your reasoning, your reaction. Because once you're reacting emotionally, your judgment is compromised. You stop thinking clearly. You start operating from a place of anxiety, defensiveness, guilt, or craving, and in any of those states, you are far easier to steer. Think about how this plays out in real life. Criticism delivered at the right moment creates defensiveness, and a defensive person is easy to exhaust. They're so busy justifying themselves that they lose track of what the actual conversation was about. Suddenly, the argument is about them, their intentions, their character, and the original issue has quietly disappeared. Praise given strategically creates compliance. Someone who feels seen and appreciated will almost always say yes to what comes next. They're in an open, warm, emotional state. Their guard is down. This is not cynical, this is just human. But it means that flattery, when used deliberately, is a setup, and most people walk into it completely unaware. Withdrawal, coldness, silence, distance creates anxiety in anyone who cares about the relationship. And anxious people chase. They pursue. They over-explain. They become accommodating in ways they wouldn't be if they were calm. Silence can be a weapon, and it's one of the most effective ones available because it requires no effort and leaves no fingerprints. Here's what most people never realize. You don't protect yourself from these tactics by becoming suspicious of everyone. You protect yourself by becoming less reactive. When criticism doesn't destabilize you, it loses its power. When silence doesn't send you into anxiety, withdrawal stops working. When praise doesn't make you compliant, flattery becomes just words. The tactic only works if the emotional reaction is there to trigger. Remove the reaction, and the tactic has nothing to grab. Part 5. How approval seeking becomes a form of control. Approval seeking is one of the most common and least examined ways people give away their power. And the reason it's so hard to see is that it usually looks like something else: politeness, conscientiousness, warmth, accommodation. But pay attention to what's really happening underneath. When you need someone's approval, you're not free in that relationship. You can't tell them an uncomfortable truth because you're afraid of how they'll react. You can't hold a boundary because their disappointment would feel unbearable. You can't disagree because disagreement might cost you their validation. So you agree with things you don't believe. You tolerate things that aren't acceptable. You shape your behavior and eventually your thoughts around what keeps them comfortable and keeps you in their good graces. That is control. Soft, invisible, never spoken, but control. Think about it in a work context. If your sense of worth at a job comes primarily from your manager's praise, then your manager doesn't even have to threaten you to direct your behavior. They just have to withhold the praise, or give it selectively, or create uncertainty about where you stand. And you will work harder, stay quieter, or be more agreeable, not because you were told to, but because your emotional need to receive their approval is driving you from the inside. This is where people lose control. They think they're choosing their actions, but they're actually being guided by a craving. The craving for validation, and cravings are not choices. The same dynamic plays out in friendships, in romantic relationships, in family structures. Wherever there is an emotional need for approval, the person whose approval you need holds leverage over you. They may never use it consciously, but it's there, and it limits you in ways you can't always see because the limitation feels like caring. Here's the truth. You can care deeply about someone's feelings without needing their approval to feel okay about yourself. Those are completely different things, and the gap between them is exactly where your freedom lives. Part 6. What emotional detachment actually means. Here's what most people get wrong about emotional detachment. They hear the word detachment and they imagine someone cold, someone who doesn't care, someone who has shut themselves off from the human experience to protect themselves from pain, someone sitting behind glass, observing life without participating in it. That is not emotional detachment. That's emotional numbness. And it's not powerful, it's just another kind of damage. Real emotional detachment is something else entirely. It is the ability to be fully present in a situation, to feel what is genuinely happening, and still choose your response rather than being driven by your reaction. The difference is everything. A person without emotional detachment is like a boat without an anchor. Every emotional weather system, someone's anger, someone's withdrawal, someone's praise, someone's disappointment moves them. The storm comes and they go with it. They have no fixed point. A person with emotional detachment has an anchor. They feel the weather. They are not numb to it, but they do not go with it. They stay where they are. They observe. They choose. Think about what that looks like in practice. Someone criticizes you harshly, and instead of immediately defending yourself or shutting down or retaliating, you feel the sting of it and then pause. You ask yourself whether the criticism is useful, whether it's true, what the most intelligent response is. You respond from that place rather than from the wound. Someone withdraws from you, and instead of immediately chasing or spiraling or over-explaining, you feel the discomfort and then stay with it. You don't rush to close the gap. You wait. You watch. You respond to what's real rather than to your anxiety about what might be real. Someone flatters you, and instead of opening up and becoming accommodating, you receive it warmly, but you don't change your behavior based on it. You remain the same person you were before the praise arrived. That is emotional detachment, not coldness, not indifference, stability, the kind that comes from inside rather than from external conditions. Part 7. How emotional detachment creates freedom and power. When you stop being emotionally reactive, something remarkable happens to your social life. People stop being able to manipulate you, not because you've become suspicious of them, but because the tactics no longer have anything to grip. Guilt doesn't work on someone who examines it before accepting it. Silence doesn't destabilize someone who is comfortable in their own company. Criticism doesn't control someone who can hear it without crumbling. Praise doesn't redirect someone who doesn't need it to feel whole. You become, without trying to become, much harder to influence, and much more interesting to be around. Here's what most people never realize. Emotional stability is magnetic. Not the performance of it, not pretending to be unbothered, but the real thing. The quality of a person who is genuinely present, genuinely calm, genuinely unworried about how they are being perceived in this moment. People are drawn to that the way they're drawn to warmth. Because most people spend most of their time in some degree of emotional anxiety, and being near someone who isn't feels like relief. Your relationships also change quality. When you don't need approval, you stop attracting people who give it strategically. When you don't react to guilt, you stop being targeted by people who use it. When you're not afraid of someone's withdrawal, you stop tolerating behavior that deserves to be addressed. The relationships that remain are ones built on something more solid, on genuine respect rather than emotional leverage. And the most important shift, you get your own direction back. When other people's emotions are no longer the primary force steering your behavior, you can ask yourself what you actually want, what you actually think, what you actually value, and then move toward it without stopping every 10 steps to check whether everyone around you approves of the path. That is what emotional detachment gives you, not distance from life, access to it on your own terms. Part 8. How to actually develop emotional detachment. This is where most scripts give you a list of tips that sound helpful and change nothing. I'm going to give you something more honest than that. Emotional detachment is not a technique, it's a practice. And it starts with one thing, learning to create a gap between stimulus and response. Right now, for most people, that gap doesn't exist. Something happens, a harsh word, a cold message, an unexpected silence, and the reaction follows instantly, automatically. The emotion arrives and the behavior follows it without any space in between. The entire practice of emotional detachment is about inserting a pause into that sequence. Just a pause, not a suppression of the feeling, not a performance of calm, just a moment of observation before the response. In practice, this means the next time you feel an emotional reaction rising, the next time someone says something that triggers defensiveness, or withholds something that triggers anxiety, or praises you in a way that feels suspiciously timed, you don't act from it immediately. You notice it first. You name it to yourself. You sit inside the discomfort for long enough to ask, is this reaction giving me accurate information, or is it just a reaction? Sometimes the reaction is accurate. Sometimes the anger is justified. Sometimes the hurt is telling you something true. Emotional detachment doesn't mean dismissing your emotions. It means interviewing them before you let them drive. The second practice is removing your self-worth from other people's behavior. This one is harder and more important. Every time you feel your mood shift based on someone else's reaction to you, their approval, their silence, their criticism, ask yourself, why is their behavior determining my internal state? What does that tell me about where I've placed my stability? This is not comfortable work, but it is the work. Because every time you catch yourself giving someone else's behavior that kind of power over you, and you choose, even once, to hold your own ground instead, you are building something. A different relationship with yourself. One that becomes, over time, harder for the outside world to shake. The third practice is sitting comfortably with being misunderstood. This is the one most people resist the longest. The urge to explain yourself, to correct a wrong impression, to make sure people see you accurately, that urge is strong. But every time you chase being understood, you're telling yourself that their perception of you matters more than your own. Start practicing the tolerance of being misread. Start letting some things go uncorrected. The silence will be uncomfortable at first. It gets easier. And what builds in that silence is something much more valuable than being understood, it's self-trust. Part 9. Conclusion. Here is the reality of the life you're living right now, if none of this changes. Your mood tomorrow will depend on how someone texts you back. Your sense of worth next week will rise or fall based on whether someone approves of a decision you made. In 6 months, You'll still be editing yourself in front of certain people, still chasing a version of their reaction that finally feels like enough, still giving away your clarity and your direction, and your time to the management of their perception of you. Not because you're weak, not because you don't know better, but because emotional reactivity is the default, and defaults don't change without deliberate effort. The people who are free, genuinely, quietly free, are not the ones who stopped caring. They're the ones who stopped needing. They move through the world with their own sense of what is true and what matters and what they will and will not accept, and that internal structure made them nearly impossible to manipulate, nearly impossible to destabilize, and almost effortlessly powerful in every room they entered. That is available to you. It is not a personality type. It is not a gift some people are born with. It is a skill. And like every skill, it is built through practice, through the repeated, unglamorous choice to pause before reacting, to hold your ground when anxiety tells you to chase, to stay with discomfort instead of immediately trying to resolve it. The moment you stop needing other people to determine how you feel, you become someone they can no longer control. Not someone they fear, not someone they resent. Someone they cannot move. And that is a different kind of power than most people ever know is possible.